November 12, 1942. North Atlantic. Pre-dawn darkness. Sea state rough. Visibility near zero. The deck of Shipyard U-123 shuddered as its diesel engines idled just below the surface. Inside the conning tower, astonished, Kapitän Leutnant Ernst Vogt pressed his headphones tighter against his ears, listening to the hollow echo of propellers slicing through cold Atlantic water. Somewhere ahead, an American convoy moved blindly through the night. Fat silhouettes against a darker horizon, engines thudding in slow, predictable rhythm. Then the order came. Torpedoes, los. The boat lurched as steel fish streaked forward. Seconds later, the ocean erupted. A Liberty ship split open amidships, flame roaring skyward as cargo detonated. Another ship burned, then another. American sailors leapt into black water lit by fire. For Vogt, it felt familiar, almost routine. Since January, U-boats had slaughtered Allied shipping along the American coast with shocking ease. The enemy, German naval intelligence insisted, could not replace ships at this rate. No nation could. But as Vogt watched the wreckage settle into the sea, his radio man passed up a signal intercept. American convoy schedules updated again. New hull numbers, new ship names, ships that, according to German estimates, should not yet exist. For the first time that night, Vogt frowned. Something about the numbers didn't add up. Months earlier, in Berlin, the idea would have drawn laughter. In 1941 and early 1942, the Kriegsmarine viewed American shipbuilding with open disdain. German planners measured naval power through craftsmanship, precision welding, skilled labor, years of apprenticeship. Warships were built by experts, not rushed by amateurs. The Americans, in contrast, were thought to rely on spectacle and scale, incapable of producing quality under pressure. German naval doctrine rested on a belief older than the war itself, that industrial output required time, discipline, and tradition. Europe had shipyards centuries old. America had optimism and advertising. When reports arrived claiming that the United States was launching cargo ships in weeks rather than months, analysts dismissed them as propaganda. When British intelligence warned that American yards were adopting assembly line methods, German officials scoffed. Ships were not automobiles. Steel did not obey slogans. And then there was the workforce. German intelligence noted, almost mockingly, that many American shipyard workers were women, farmers, mechanics, and laborers with no maritime background. Civilians. People trained in weeks, not years. To German naval officers raised in rigid technical hierarchies, the notion bordered on absurd. A ship, they believed, carried the skill of its builder in every rivet. Rushing meant weakness. Speed meant failure. That belief followed U-boat commanders like Vogt into the Atlantic. In early 1942, the numbers favored Germany overwhelmingly. During Operation Paukenschlag, German submarines sank over 600 Allied ships in less than a year. American coastal defenses were unprepared. Convoys were poorly organized. Losses outpaced construction, or so it seemed. From the perspective of a U-boat captain, victory looked inevitable. Each patrol returned the same results. Each radio report confirmed the same assumption. America was bleeding tonnage faster than it could be replaced. German propaganda reinforced it relentlessly. The Reich's newspapers spoke of an industrial giant exposed as hollow, unable to sustain real war. Yet quietly, far from the Atlantic, a different rhythm was taking shape. On the southeast west coast of the United States, shipyards worked under floodlights that never turned off. Welders rotated in shifts measured not by clocks, but by output. Hull sections appeared not as ships, but as components, Flat steel plates, prefabricated bulkheads, standardized engine mounts. Pieces that could be assembled by repetition rather than mastery. To German eyes, this was not shipbuilding, it was desecration. The names meant nothing to them at first. Richmond, California, Portland, Oregon, Vancouver, Washington. Yards run by a man the Germans barely bothered to profile. Henry J. Kaiser. A civilian, a construction magnate, not a naval architect, not an admiral. When intelligence summaries mentioned Kaiser's methods, modular construction, standardized blueprints, workforce training measured in days, German analysts circled the reports in red ink. Unreliable, unsustainable, inferior quality. One officer reportedly remarked that the Americans were building coffins for their sailors. At sea, U-boat commanders believed it. They saw ships break apart under torpedo impact and assumed it proved their point. Early Liberty ships did fracture under stress. German observers seized on these failures as evidence that speed equaled weakness. What they did not see, what they could not see, was the math changing beneath the surface. Each sinking that Vogt recorded removed a ship measured in weeks of American labor. Each patrol he completed consumed months of German training, fuel, and irreplaceable crew experience. The imbalance was subtle at first, almost invisible. But the Atlantic was about to become a ledger. The first warning signs did not come from Washington or London. They came from the Atlantic itself. February 1943. Mid-Atlantic Gap. Gray seas, overcast skies, rising swell. Kapitänleutnant Ernst Vogt stood rigid in U-123's control room as the sonar operator whispered numbers under his breath. Propeller noise. Multiple screws this time. Not scattered freighters. A convoy. Organized, tight, moving faster than expected. This was new. Only months earlier, American convoys had been sloppy affairs. Poor spacing, uneven speeds, minimal escort. Now the sound profile told a different story. Destroyers weaving. Corvettes holding station. The Americans were learning. Quickly. Vogt fired anyway. One torpedo struck a Liberty ship on the starboard quarter. Flames erupted. The crew cheered, briefly. Then the escorts reacted with a precision Vogt had never encountered from Americans before. Depth charges rolled into the sea in calculated patterns, hammering the hull with concussive force. Lights flickered. Gauges shook. Men braced against steel bulkheads. U-123 escaped, but barely. When Vogt returned to port weeks later, he filed his report. Sinkings were still occurring, but something had changed. Convoys were larger, escorts more aggressive, and most unsettling of all, the ships kept coming. Back in Berlin, analysts began assembling tonnage reports from across the Atlantic. What they saw made no sense. Losses were still high. In raw numbers, the U-boat fleet was performing. But the expected result, collapse of Allied shipping, was not materializing. Instead, convoy sizes were increasing. Ports were congested not with shortages, but with arrivals. One analyst noted a disturbing trend. For every American ship sunk, 2 new hulls appeared on Allied registers within weeks. That was impossible by European standards. German shipyards required months to complete a single cargo vessel. Skilled welders were scarce. Materials were rationed. Bombing raids disrupted schedules. Every hull represented a major investment of time and expertise. So where were these ships coming from? The answer arrived in fragments, intercepted reports, aerial reconnaissance, and finally, photographs. Richmond, California, spring 1943. A German intelligence packet landed on a desk inside the Kriegsmarine's operations staff. Inside were aerial images of a sprawling industrial complex along the San Francisco Bay. The photographs showed something unprecedented. Dozens of nearly identical ship hulls under construction simultaneously, not sequentially, at the same time. Rows of steel sections lay stacked like crates. Gantry cranes moved pre-assembled modules into place. Welding teams swarmed hulls in synchronized motion. This was not craftsmanship. It was production. The name stamped across the report was unfamiliar to most German officers. Kaiser Shipyards. Further investigation only deepened the shock. Henry Kaiser had rejected traditional shipbuilding outright. Instead of constructing ships from keel to mast in a linear process, his yards built them like machines. Hulls were divided into standardized sections. Bow, stern, midship blocks, fabricated independently, then welded together in final assembly. A Liberty ship no longer required a master shipwright overseeing every step. It required coordination, timing, repetition. Most alarming of all, workers were trained in specific tasks, not entire trades. A welder learned one seam. A rigger learned one lift. Thousands of civilians, many with no prior industrial experience, became specialists in days. German intelligence struggled to frame it. Their entire naval doctrine assumed that quality demanded time. Kaiser's yards suggested the opposite, that quality could be engineered into the process itself. Then came the number that finally broke disbelief. November 1942, Richmond Shipyard No. 2. The report stated that a Liberty ship named SS Robert E. Peary had been laid down, assembled, launched, and delivered in Maastricht 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. German officers read the figure repeatedly, assuming a translation error. 4 days. That was less time than it took German yards to prepare slipways. Some dismissed it as a stunt, a one-time demonstration, propaganda theater. Surely the ship would be unusable in combat. But Allied shipping logs told a different story. The Peary entered service. Then another ship. Then another. Launch intervals shortened. Yard records showed ships sliding into the water every few days, not months. The Americans were not accelerating gradually. They were compounding. For U-boat commanders, the change was brutal. By mid-1943, patrol reports told the same story again and again. Sinkings achieved, but strategic impact diminishing. Where once torpedo strikes created gaps in convoy schedules, now replacements appeared almost immediately. You could feel it in the Atlantic. Depth charge patterns grew denser, air patrols ranged farther, escort carriers began appearing, converted merchant hulls carrying aircraft that hunted submarines relentlessly. The war at sea was no longer about sinking ships. It was about outrunning a factory. And Germany was losing that race. By the summer of 1943, the Atlantic had become a different ocean. What had once been a vast hunting ground now felt crowded, watched. From the bridge of Main-Nenadastu, Yasko 123. Ark, Captain Lieutenant Ernst Vogt sensed it before he saw it. The air patrols came earlier. The sonar contacts were sharper. Convoys moved with the discipline of drilled formations, not improvisation. And always, there were more ships. May 1943. North Atlantic, west of Ireland. Vogt periscoped at dawn and froze. The convoy ahead was massive. Over occupied 60 merchant vessels, flanked by destroyers, corvettes, and something new. An escort carrier riding low in the water. Aircraft engines hummed overhead, circling like vultures. This was not an accident. This was doctrine. The Americans and British had adapted. But adaptation alone did not explain the scale. What folks saw was not just tactical improvement. It was industrial confidence. Losses no longer dictated caution. They dictated tempo. Every Liberty ship now carried standardized fittings, identical cargo holds, interchangeable parts, uniform engine layouts. Damage reports from torpedo hits showed something unsettling. Ships staying afloat longer, crews abandoning in organized fashion, escorts reacting instantly. The Allies were no longer improvising survival. They had rehearsed it. Behind the scenes, Kaiser shipyards were feeding this transformation relentlessly. Liberty ships gave way to Victory ships, faster and stronger, capable of flying 15 to 17 knots, compared to the Liberty's 11. The new hulls reduced vulnerability windows. Escorts could maneuver more aggressively, knowing replacements were already en route from American ports. German U-boat command began to feel the pressure from both ends. At sea, losses mounted. In May 1943 alone, Germany lost 41 U-boats. Stouts, a catastrophic blow. Sonar-guided depth charges, radar-equipped patrol aircraft, and the relentless presence of escort carriers compressed the battle space until escape became improbable. On land, the numbers haunted planners. German shipyards could not compensate. Bombing raids disrupted steel production. Skilled labor was stretched thin. Each submarine lost represented years of training and experience, crews that could not be replaced quickly. Meanwhile, American shipyards did not slow. They accelerated. Liberty ships were no longer headline events. They were routine. Ship launches became industrial punctuation marks, one after another, sliding into the water under the same cranes, crewed by workers who had assembled hundreds before. In Berlin, the ideological contradiction became impossible to ignore. German doctrine prized elite skill, hierarchical mastery, and long preparation. American shipbuilding rejected all three. It favored redundancy over elegance, scale over perfection, systems over individuals. And on the battlefield, that philosophy was winning. For Vogt, the realization came not during an attack, but during retreat. After a failed approach in late May, U-1123 dove deep, evading a relentless depth charge barrage. The hull creaked, the lights flickered, men whispered prayers into steel compartments. Hours later, battered but alive, the submarine limped away. Vogt stood alone in the control room, staring at the Atlantic plotted on the chart table. The shipping lanes were thicker than ever. New routes appeared where sinkings had once created voids. The enemy was not reacting anymore. They were advancing. Reports from other U-boat captains echoed the same dread. Sinkings no longer mattered strategically. The Allies absorbed losses without pause. Convoys grew larger after defeats, not smaller. Every torpedo fired felt less like a victory and more like a delay. German intelligence officers, forced to reconcile reality, began rewriting assessments. The phrase appeared quietly in memoranda. American shipbuilding capacity exceeds all previous estimates. It was an understatement. By the end of 1943, the United States had produced over 2,700 Liberty ships. The number was staggering, not just in scale, but in implication. Each hull represented cargo delivered, troops moved, fuel supplied, and time denied to the Axis. The Atlantic battle had evolved. It was no longer about tactics at sea. It was about whether courage and skill could overcome a nation that treated war as an engineering problem and solved it faster than its enemy could adapt. Germany had entered the conflict believing mastery would prevail. They were discovering that mastery without mass was fatal. The breaking point came not with an explosion, but with a calculation. Late 1943. Berlin. Naval High Command Briefing Room. Charts covered the walls. Tonnage sunk, tonnage launched, projected attrition curves. For months, officers had argued over tactics. New wolf-pack formations, improved torpedoes, deeper patrol zones. But the numbers on the board no longer responded to tactical solutions. No matter how the lines were redrawn, the outcome stayed the same. American production outpaced German destruction. By now, Kaiser's shipyards were operating like clockwork. Richmond, then shipyards number 1 through number 4, functioned as parallel factories, each launching ships at a pace that defied European comprehension. Victory ships followed Liberty ships down the ways, their turbines humming with more power, their hulls designed for speed and endurance. The Americans had not merely fixed a problem. They had institutionalized victory. The technological climax of this shift was not a single ship, but a system. Modular construction allowed damaged ships to be repaired, using pre-built sections shipped directly to ports. Standardized engines meant spare parts fit hundreds of hulls. Training manuals were identical across fleets. Crews transferred seamlessly between ships without retraining. And above all, the numbers crushed resistance. In January 1944, Aussie, U.S. shipyards launched more merchant tonnage in 1 month than Germany had built in an entire year. For U-boat commanders like Ernst Vogt, this reality arrived brutally at sea. March 1944. Western approaches. Vogt tracked a convoy for 2 days, waiting for darkness. When he finally fired, 1 torpedo struck home. The Liberty ship slowed, smoke rising, but did not sink. Damage control teams responded immediately. Within hours, the ship was under tow. Escorted, protected. Vogt retreated. Fuel low, nerves frayed. Days later, intelligence intercepts confirmed the worst possible outcome. The damaged ship had reached port, been repaired using prefabricated sections, and returned to service within weeks. Weeks. The same amount of time Vogt would now spend retraining replacement crew members lost to exhaustion, fear, and death. German naval intelligence finally abandoned denial. Reports acknowledged that American industrial doctrine had created a new form of warfare, one where losses were anticipated, absorbed, and neutralized by scale. The Atlantic had become an industrial battlefield, and Germany did not have the factories. By mid-1944, the U-boat fleet was in retreat. Patrol zones shrank. Crews were younger. Training was shorter. Survivability plummeted. The ideological foundation of German naval confidence, technical superiority, and elite skill collapsed under the weight of mass production. For the Allies, the breakthrough meant freedom of movement. Ships delivered men and materiel to Britain without interruption. Fuel flowed. Tanks arrived. Aircraft crossed oceans in crates and took to the skies over Europe. The invasion of Normandy would not have been possible without this logistical avalanche. Kaiser's shipyards never saw the beaches of France, but they built the tide that carried armies across the sea. And for Germany, the realization was devastatingly simple. You cannot torpedo a factory that builds faster than you can aim. The truth finally confronted Germany face to face. Not in a briefing room, but behind barbed wire. June 1944. Western France. Overcast skies. Damp ground. Distant artillery rumble. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Bauer, a former U-boat engineering officer reassigned to coastal defense, stood with his hands raised as American infantry closed in. His unit had been overrun within hours. The supplies they expected never arrived. The roads behind them were already crowded with Allied vehicles, trucks, fuel tankers, mobile workshops. moving inland with mechanical certainty. Within days, Bauer found himself aboard a transport ship, not as a combatant, but as cargo. The crossing to the United States was his first direct encounter with the enemy beyond propaganda. The ship was not new, but it was functional, well-maintained, and crewed by calm, confident sailors who spoke openly about schedules, rotations, and ports Bauer had never heard of. At his Camp Ruston, Louisiana, interrogations began. American officers were methodical, almost casual. They asked about U-boat patrol lengths, repair times, crew training cycles. Bauer answered honestly, and then listened as his interrogators shared figures in return. Not boasts, not threats, just facts. How long to train a U-boat crew? 18 months, Bauer replied. How long to build a submarine? 2 to 3 years. Then came the question that ended the conversation. How long do you think it takes us to build a ship? When Bauer hesitated, the officer slid a photograph across the table. It showed a Liberty ship sliding down the ways, crowds blurred by motion. The caption read, SS Robert E. Peary, 4 days. Bauer thought it was a trick. Over the following weeks, reality settled in through routine. POWs were fed regularly. Camps received steady supplies. Guards rotated predictably. Newspapers, uncensored Allied papers, reported ship launches by the dozen. American industrial output was no longer abstract. It was visible in every meal, every blanket, every transport truck that never seemed to run out of fuel. German POWs talked among themselves. Former U-boat men compared notes with infantry officers. Engineers calculated timelines. Artillerymen counted vehicles. The same conclusion emerged again and again. Germany had planned for a war of superiority. America had planned for a war of replacement. For many prisoners, the psychological collapse came not from defeat, but from scale. The realization that even perfect tactics could not overcome an enemy who treated losses as variables, not tragedies. One POW reportedly wrote in a letter home, later intercepted by censors, "They do not fear losing ships. They fear losing time." That fear never materialized. By the end of 1944, German naval prisoners understood something their commanders had not accepted early enough. The Atlantic War had already been decided, not by torpedoes or bravery, but by factories thousands of miles away. Factories manned by civilians. Factories that never slept. When the war ended in May 1945, the Atlantic was quiet, not because ships had stopped moving, but because nothing remained that could stop them. The U-boat pens stood abandoned. The slipways in Germany were empty or bombed flat. Crews returned home to a nation that had exhausted its steel, its fuel, and its time. Across the ocean, American shipyards were still running. The same cranes that had launched Liberty and Victory ships pivoted to peacetime contracts almost seamlessly. Workers who had learned welding in weeks now carried those skills into a post-war economy. Ports that had once handled emergency tonnage became arteries of global trade. Henry Kaiser's methods did not disappear with the war. They spread. Modular construction, standardized components, workforce specialization. These principles reshaped global industry. Shipbuilding, aviation, manufacturing, even housing adopted the same logic. Build systems, not masterpieces. Design for replacement, not perfection. Militarily, the lesson was even starker. World War II proved that modern warfare was no longer won solely by battlefield brilliance or elite formations. It was won by logistics, production velocity, and strategic endurance. The side that could recover fastest, not fight best, would dominate longest. German officers understood this too late. Their doctrine prized technical excellence and hierarchical control, but it resisted decentralization and mass training. In a war measured in years and oceans, that resistance was fatal. The SS Robert E. Peary never fired a shot. It never appeared in battle reports or victory parades. Yet, its 4-day construction time symbolized a turning point in human conflict, the moment when war became an engineering equation, and America solved it at scale. Every tank that rolled through France, every bomber that crossed the Rhine, every ration crate unloaded on a distant shore. They all rode on hulls built faster than an enemy could adapt. History remembers generals and battles. But beneath them all lies a quieter truth. Germany lost the war when it realized, too late, that it was fighting men, while America was fighting time.